The violet gas Singak had told him terrible things of the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, and had warned him never to approach the central void where the demon Sultan Azathoth grows hungrily in the dark. Altogether, it was not well to meddle with the Elder Ones, and if they persisted, denied Al access to the marvelous Sunset City, it were better not to seek that city. Tyrannus, furthermore, doubted whether his guest would profit aught by coming to the city, even were he to gain it. He himself had dreamed and yearned long years for lovely Celophae in the land of Uth-Nargai, for the freedom and color of high experience devoid of its chains, conventions, and stupidities. But now that he was come into that city, in that land, and was the king thereof, he found the freedom and the vividness all too soon worn out, and monotonous for want of linkage with anything firm in his feelings and memories. He was a king in Uth-Nargai, but found no meaning therein, and drooped always for the old familiar things of England that had shaped his youth. All his kingdom would he give for the sound of Cornish church bells over the downs, and all the 1,000 minarets of Celophae for the steep, homely roofs of the village near his home. So he contented his guest that the unknown Sunset City might not hold quite the content he sought, and that perhaps it had better remain a glorious and half-remembered dream. For he had visited Carter often in the old waking days, and knew well the lovely New England slopes that had given him birth. At the last, he was very certain that the seeker would long only for the early remembered scenes: the glow of the Beacon Hill at evening, the tall steeples at winding hill streets of quaint Kingsport, the hoary gambo roofs of ancient and witch-haunted Arkham, and the blessed miles of meads and valleys where stone walls rambled and white farmhouse gables peeked out from bowers of verdure. These things he told Randolph Carter, but still the seeker held to his purpose. And in the end, they parted each with his own conviction, and Carter went back through the bronze case into Celophae and down the street of the pillars to the old seawall, where he talked more with the mariners of far parts and waited for the dark ships from cold and twilight Ingannock, whose strange-faced sailors and onyx traders had in them the blood of the great ones. One starlight evening, when the Faroes shone splendid over the harbor, the longed-for ship put in, and strange-faced sailors and traders appeared one by one and group by group in the ancient taverns along the seawall. It was very exciting to see again those living faces so like the godlike features on Negranic. But Carter did not hasten to speak with the silent seaman. He did not know how much of pride and secrecy and dim supernal memory might fill those children of great ones, but was sure it would not be wise to tell them of his quest or ask too closely of that cold desert stretching north of their twilight land. They talked little with the other folk in those ancient sea taverns, but would gather in groups in remote corners and sing among themselves in the haunting airs of unknown places, or chant long tales to one another in accents alien to the rest of dreamland. And so rare and moving were those airs and tales that one might guess their wonders from the faces of those who listened. Even the words came to common ears only as a strange cadence and obscure melody. For a week, the strange seaman lingered in the taverns and traded in the bazaars of Celophae. And before they sailed, Carter had taken passage on their dark ship, telling them that he was an old onyx miner and wishful to work in their quarries. That ship was very lovely and cunningly wrought, being of teak wood and ebony fittings and traceries of gold, and the cabin in which the traveler lodged and had hangings of silken velvet. One morning, at the turn of the tide, the sails were raised and the anchor lifted, and as Carter stood on the high stern, he saw the sunrise blazing walls and bronze statues and golden minarets of ageless Salafis sink into the distance, and the snowy peak of Mount Aaron grew smaller and smaller. By noon there was nothing in sight save the gentle blue of the Cimmerian Sea. With one painted galley afar off bound for that cloud-hung realm of Serenian, where the sea meets the sky. And night came with gorgeous stars, and the dark ship steered for Charles's Wain and Little Bear as they swung slowly around the pole. And the sailors sang strange songs of unknown places, and then stole off one by one to the forecastle, while the wistful watchers murmured old chants and leaned over the rail to glimpse the luminous fish playing in the bowers beneath the sea. Carter went to sleep at midnight and rose in the glow of young morning, marking the sun seemed farther south than it was wont. Was its wont. And although through the second day he made progress in knowing the men of the ship, getting them little by little to talk of their cold twilight land, of their exquisite onyx city, and of their fear of the high and impassable peaks beyond which Lang was sent to be. He told them how sorry he was there were no cats that would stay in the land of Enoch, and how they thought that the hidden nearness of Lang was to blame for it. Only of the stony desert to the north they would not talk. There was something disquieting about that desert, and it was thought expedient not to admit its existence. On later days, they talked of the quarries in which Carter said he was going to work. There were many of them, for all the city of Enoch was built of onyx, whilst great polished blocks of it were traded in Reinar, Agrothan, and Celophanes, and at home, with its merchants of Thra, Alarnec, and Kadatheron, for the beautiful wares of those fabulous ports. And far to the north, and almost in that cold desert whose existence the men of Enoch did not care to admit, there was an unused quarry greater than all the rest, from which had been hewn in forgotten times such prodigious lumps and blocks that the sight of their chiseled vacancies struck horror to all who beheld. Terror to all who beheld. Who would mind those incredible blocks and whither they had been transported, no man might say, but it was thought best not to trouble that quarry, around which no such inhuman memories might conceivably cling. So it was left all alone in twilight, with only the raven and the rumored shantak bird to brood on its immensities. When Carter heard of this quarry, he was moved to deep thought, for he knew it from old tales that the Great One's castle atop unknown Kadath is of onyx. Each day the sun wheeled lower and lower in the sky, and the mist overhead grew thicker and thicker. And in 2 weeks there was not any sunlight at all, but only a weird gray twilight shining through the dome of eternal cloud by day, and a cold starless phosphorescence from under the side of that cloud by night. On the 20th day, that great jagged rock in the sea was sighted from afar, and the first land glimpsed since Aaron's snowy peak had dwindled behind the ship. Carter asked the captain the name of that rock, but was told it had no name. It had never been sought by any vessel because of the sounds that came from it by night. And when after dark, after a dull, ceaseless howling arose from that jagged granite place, The traveler was glad that no stop had been made, and the rock had no name. The seaman prayed and chanted until the noise was out of earshot, and Carter dreamed terrible dreams within dreams in the small hours. 2 mornings after that, there loomed far ahead to the east a line of great gray peaks whose tops were lost in the changeless clouds of that twilight world. And at the sight of them, the sailors sang glad songs, and some knelt down on the deck to pray, so that Carter knew that they had come to the land of Ignatoch, and that was to be moored to the basalt quays of the great town bearing that land's name. Toward noon, a dark coastline appeared, and before 3 o'clock there stood out against the north of the bulbous domes and fantastic spires of the onyx city. Rare and curious did that archaic city rise above its walls and quays, all delicate blackened scrolls, flutings, and arabesques of inlaid gold. Tall and many windowed were the houses, and carved on every side with flowers and patterns whose dark symmetries dazzled the eye with beauty more poignant than light. Some ended in swelling domes that tapered to a point, others in terraced pyramids whereon rose clustered minarets, displaying every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low and playing every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low and pierced by frequent gates, each under a great arch rising high above the general level and capped with the head of a god, chiseled with that same skill displayed in the monstrous face on distant granite. On a hill in the center rose a 16-angled tower, greater than all the rest and bearing a high pinnacled belfry resting on a flattened dome. This, the seaman said, was the temple of the Elder Ones, and was ruled by an old high priest sad with inner secrets. At intervals, the clang of a strange bell shivered over the onyx city, answered each time by a peal of mystic music made up of horns, viols, and chanting voices. And from a row of tripods on the gallery round the high dome of this temple burst flares of flame at certain moments. For the priests and people of that city were wise in the primal mysteries, and faithful in keeping the rhythms of the great ones as set forth in scrolls older than the Akkadic manuscripts. As the ship rode past the great basalt breakwater in the harbor, the lesser noises of the city grew manifest, and Carter saw the slaves, sailors, and merchants on the docks. The sailors and the merchants were of the strange-faced race of the gods, but the slaves were squat, slant-eyed folk, said by rumor to have drifted somehow across or around the impassable peaks from valleys beyond Lang. The wharves reached wide outside the city wall and bore upon them all manner of merchandise from the galleries anchored there, while at one end were the great piles of onyx, both carved and uncarved, waiting shipment to the great markets of Reinar, Agrothen, and Celophages. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside a jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders followed ashore and through the arched gate into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, while others were crooked and narrow. The houses were near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold said to be honor of the respective small gods that favored each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old sea tavern where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day show him the wonders of that twilight city and lead him to the taverns of the onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors of that tavern sang songs of remote places. But when from its high tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peal of the horns and vials and roses rose cryptical and answered thereto. All sea-stirred songs or tales and ballads silent to the last echo died away. For there is a wonder and strangeness on the twilight city of Adnanoc, and men fear to be lax in its rites lest the doom and vengeance lurk unsuspectedly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably like that old slant-eyed merchant he had seen so long before in the taverns of Dylath Lean, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages of Lang, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar. And even to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face, and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone mason monastery. This man had seemed to show a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Dylath Lean about the cold waste of Kadath. And somehow his presence in dark and haunted Adnanoc, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him, and sailors later said that he had come with a yak caravan from some point not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich-flavored eggs of the rumored shantak bird to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought from Ilarnek. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Adnanoc, dark under the twilight sky. The inlaid doors were in figured front houses, carven balconies, and crystal paint oriels, and all gleamed with a somber and polished loveliness. And every now and then a plaza would open out with some black pillars, colonnades, and statues of curious beings, both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets on through side valleys or over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesque roofs were weird and beautiful beyond words. And nothing was more splendid than the massive height of the great central temple of the Elder Ones, with its 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and its lofty pinnacled belfry, overtopping all else and majestic whatever its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city walls and leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt gray sides of those topless and impassable peaks across which hideous lane was said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with the walled garden in the great round plaza where the streets go as spokes from a wheel's hub. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having over it a carven face like those of the city's gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled paths and through the lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of onyx, having in them small luminous fish taken by drivers from the lower bowers of the ocean. When the deep clang of the temple's belfry shivers over the garden and the city, and the answer of the horns and the vials voices peals out from the 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue from the 7 doors of the temple long columns of masked and hooded priests, in black, and bearing at the arm's length before them great golden bowls from which a curious steam rises. And all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in single file. legs thrown far forward without bending the knees down the walls that lead to the 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said that the subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx steps go down to the mysteries that are never told. But only a few of those are those who hint that the priests of the masks and hooded columns are not human priests. Carter did not enter the temple because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that. But before he left the garden, the hour of the bell came, and he heard the shivering clang deafening above him, and the wailing of the horns and viols and voices loud from the lodges by the gates. And down the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests in their singular way, giving to the traveler a fear which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he left that garden, noting that as he did so, a spot on the pavement over which the bowls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him onto the hill whereon the veiled king's palace rised many-domed and marvelous. The ways of the onyx palace are steep and narrow, all but that broad curving one where the king and his companions ride on yaks and in yak-drawn chariots. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps, between inlaid walls bearing strange size and gold, and under balconies and oriels whence sometimes floated soft strains of music or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses, and clustered on bulbous domes, for which the veiled king's palace is famous. And at length they passed under a great black arch, and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There Carter paused in faintness as so much beauty, for the onyx terraces and colonnaded walks, the gay parterres and delicate flowering trees espaliered to golden lattices, the brazen urns and tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, the basalt-bottomed lagoons and tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of the iridescent singing birds atop carven columns, and the marvelous scrollwork of the great bronze gates, and the blossoming vines trained along each polished walls, all joined to form a sight whose loveliness was beyond reality, and half fabulous even in the land of dream. There it shimmered like a vision under that gray twilight sky, with the domed and fretted magnificence of the palace ahead, and the fantastic silhouette of the distant, impassable peaks on the right, and ever the small birds in the fountains sang, while the perfume of rare blossoms spread like a veil over that incredible garden. No other human presence was there, and Carter was glad it was so. Then they turned and descended again the onyx alley of the steps. For the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look too long and steadily at the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all the rumored shantak birds, and to send out queer dreams to the curious. After that, the captain took Carter to the north quarter of town, near the gate of the caravans, were the taverns of the yak merchants and the onyx miners. And there, in the low-ceiled inn of quarrymen, they said farewell. For business called the captain, whilst Carter was eager to talk with miners about in the north. There were many men in that inn, and the traveler was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he was an old miner of onyx, and anxious to know somewhat of Aethnanox quarries. But all that he learned was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and invasive about the cold desert of the north and quarry that no man visits. They had fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Lane was said to lie, and of the evil presences and nameless sentinels far north about among the scattered rocks. And they whispered also that the rumored Shantak birds are no wholesome things, it being indeed for the best that no man has ever truly seen one, for that fabled father of Shantaks in the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over the various mines for himself and to visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Ignanock, Carter hired a yak and stuffed great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans, the road lay straight betwixt tilled fields, with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses, the seekers stopped to ask questions, once finding the host so austere and reticent, and so full of an unplaced majesty, like to that in the huge features on the granite, that he felt certain he had come upon one of the great ones themselves, or upon one with full 9/10 of their blood dwelling among men. And to that austere and reticent Cotter he was careful to speak well of the gods, and to praise all the blessings they had ever accorded him. That night Carter camped in a roadside meadow beneath a great ligath tree, to which he tied his yak, and in the morning resumed his northward pilgrimage. About 10 o'clock, he reached the small domed village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in the tavern till noon. It is here that the great caravan road turns west toward Ceylon, but Carter kept on north by the quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somewhat narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tilled fields. And by evening the low hills on his left had risen to sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was close to the mining country. All the while the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered afar from his right, and the farther he went, the worse tales he heard of them from the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of the lumbering onyx carts along the way.